my name is Alexia. My pronouns are she, her. And my image description is that I'm a white woman with short blonde hair, wearing a gray beanie because it's cold today in Ohio. And behind me are two big green plants, and then some floating bookshelves, which you can't tell, but this is my disability studies little library I'm building. So fun.
I'm Mark Johnson. I'm a white male. I'm 70-ish. Well, actually, I'm a little over 70. I have a buzz cut with some gray on the side and a gray on the top. I'm currently wearing glasses because I finally decided I needed them. And I've got a blank wall behind me. Unfortunately, it might be a bathroom door, so hopefully nobody emerges out of there.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we have a whole bunch of questions for you. So kind of just starting off pretty simple. How did you meet Ed Roberts?
Well, I think probably give a little context. I was injured 50 years ago in a diving accident. And so I really, didn't become that aware of the whole disability experience until I was 19, almost 20 years old. So I did not know Ed when he was 14. I did not know Ed until, or get introduced to Ed actually, until he was the director of the Center for Independent Living there in Berkeley. And so I didn't know the rolling quads. I didn't know any of that stuff then. And what happened is I was running a group here called the National Paraplegia Foundation. It was like a support group for people with spinal injuries. And we were approached about applying for federal grant for to start an independent living center here. I mean, you might not know, but back in the late 70s, obviously after 504 passed and the regulations were signed, and there was some money available for 10 independent living centers around the country. And so our little group was approached about being, the fiscal sponsor or the home for that center in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one of the trips took, kind of as a research trip, was in 1978. And because everybody back then wanted to go to Berkeley, get on Telegraph Avenue and go, wow, this is what the world's really about, versus my upbringing in the South, right? So that's when I first met Ed, was visiting that center, trying to understand how we could, what we needed to do to start a center here, because we had already applied for the money and had already gotten approved as one of the 10 centers.
Cool. Yeah. And our second question is, so what role did Ed play in your life and how did he influence you?
That's a heavy question, Alexia. That requires a lot of thought. Well, I think, first of all, I described him like as an orienter, meaning I was obviously relatively new, a newly injured person, new to the experience of disability. I had not, the closest thing I'd come to the 504 or any kind of disability policy stuff was when DREDF there, Disability Rights Education Defense Fund, was traveling around the country doing training on 504. So I'd had a little bit of experience, but I did not know the story. I did not know Judy Heumann. I didn't know any of those folks. And so I really needed a heavy dose of orientation, and Ed played that role, was very patient with me, oriented me. Ultimately, he became a colleague, and then ultimately became a peer. So it's kind of a process of going, oh, good, someone's going to take time to introduce me, and then the next thing you know, we could actually interact, strategize together, and then ultimately he became a peer. So that's kind of how I describe the role he played. It was a very much kind of an evolution of a relationship.
Yeah. So what were, if you like, there's probably a lot, but what were some of the like initial lessons that you think you learned from Ed? You said he kind of oriented you into the disability sphere. What were some of those like initial things you learned?
I think, and I probably might say it more than once, but that, your generation talks about identity. Your generation talks about intersectionality. Your generation talks about, my generation was, we weren't that smart. Or I wasn't personally that smart. Okay, so it's not like I had been brought up to understand there was even a movement, or that there were, people coming together because they finally realized they were experts. So I think Ed, helped me understand that I actually had some expertise because I was living the experience. It's kind of like we call been there, done that. So now I'm an official been there, done that person, where I've had, I identify, it's my experience, and so I think he just gave me permission, and so and making me feel all right about being from the South and making mistakes.
Yeah.
Did we? Yeah. And I think as far as impressions, he was easy to be around. He I think he was a master at de-escalating. I mean, I remember the 60-minute interview. I think it was 1989. Where it's like, I'm trying to remember, the title was Mr. Ed, which was kind of funny because back then we used to watch the show where Mr. Ed was a talking horse. But he was able to de-escalate the interviewer, the reporter on 60 Minutes, in a very masterful way. I mean, he's laying in an iron lung being interviewed for part of that. And the way he was able to make the reporter comfortable is something that he would do all the time. It's not like he could hide it. I mean, he's in, at that time, a big old wheelchair, power chair, sometimes manual, sucking his tube. So he was a master at de-escalating. And he also was a master at, part of that de-escalation was humor. Meaning if people are going to call me a vegetable, I want to be called an artichoke. Was just a way of making people go, wow, this guy's cool, and I can talk to him and I can ask him anything. And I think he was, I think for me, I made a mistake the first time I came out there to San Francisco in the late 70s, to help organize a protest. Well, actually in the 80s, actually 87, I think it was. And, growing up in the South is a great thing, but also growing up in the South means you haven't necessarily been exposed to some things. And so, he didn't have a big head. And also let me know I didn't have to be perfect. And so even today at age 70, it's kind of nice to remind myself that I'm not perfect and I can still make mistakes. I mean, people are a little more vicious now when you do make a mistake, but so those are kind of some of the lessons as well as some of the impressions.
Yeah, that's really great. I think that's really a good lesson when you're in a movement as like far reaching and diverse as disability rights is.
Yeah, because you find yourself, anytime you navigate a new space, there's landmines, right? Um, but you don't want to feel like there have to be, you want somebody who kind of will hold your hand and walk you through it and just say, hey, you're going to step on one every once in a while. That might not be the best parallel, by the way, or best analogy, but I think you understand what I'm saying. Okay, you're new to this. You make assumptions. Um, just because things have been tried once, that doesn't mean they can't be tried 2 or 3 times. And I think that's where both Ed and a gentleman named Reverend Wade Blank, you gave me that space to make mistakes or step on myself or trip or fall or whatever kind of analogy.
Yeah, that's really great. Um, okay, well, our next question is what did Ed's legacy leave behind more broadly?
Well, I guess let me talk a little bit about for lack of a better word, I think the question you sent me was about wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Alice Wong does a real good job of this disability, visibility, and whatnot. That even back then, and think about how long ago that was. 40 plus years ago. The importance of telling your story. Making time for others. And what was interesting is to watch Ed around kids. And I don't mean kids with disabilities either, just kids. Mm-hmm. I mean, he had his own kid. Mm-hmm. And I'm married and have a 37-year-old daughter. And so, thinking about my experience growing up with my daughter, Lindsay, it wasn't until elementary school where all of a sudden she realized that I was different. Mm. When her kids started saying, what's wrong with your dad? Or will your dad ever walk again? Well, my daughter never asked that, because I was her dad. And so I think Ed created that kind of aura around people. I'm just Ed and I use an iron lung. Mm-hmm. And people help me, get dressed. And so what's the big deal here, right? So it's kind of a normalizing effect. But I think under legacy, I never saw him give up. Now, I didn't know him, what I would say, intimately. Like, it's not like Ed called me and said, hey, I'm having a bad day, Mark. Let's talk. But I never saw him give up. Or as John Lewis, I think, says, never give up, never give in. I think the legacy that he leaves is, I think, being appointed to head up the Voc Rehab Agency in California is one accomplishment, but the legacy is the fact that same agency denied him services earlier in his life, where they considered him too severely disabled to even be able to access their services. And the whole irony of him ultimately leading that same agency that denied him services kind of like, makes your head kind of go poof. Yeah. But he didn't go gotcha or poke you in the eye or, kick you in the teeth or something, right? He just did it. The Berkeley Outreach Recreation Program came out of Ed and Judy and other folks' efforts. The whole Ed Roberts campus, so I think when you look at, there's brick and mortar legacy, there's policy legacy. There's a legacy of his child. I don't know if his mom is still alive or not. But she was a pistol. In fact, my guess is, he got some of hit. My guess is she probably did some block and tackle for him when he was young, if that makes sense. I mean, Judy would say that also about her mother as well. So I think, there's definitely legacy, in a lot of different forms.
Yeah. I know you said that you didn't meet Ed until he was a little bit older. The next question is about him as a young activist, but he was still an activist when you met him. So what was he like as an activist?
I mean, I think he was easygoing. He was, I think, vulnerable like all of us to some level. I think he, I never saw Ed like as a policy wonk, but I saw him as a promoter. I mean, like ultimate promoter, right? Not like in Jerry Lewis telethon promoter, but as in, in control of the message, and very had his sound bites, and had his script, and stuck to it relentlessly. And back then it was somewhat elementary, right? See me as a person, know that I have needs and desires. I mean, it was a little different dialogue than you see now, understandably, because it was so long ago. But that's kind of a little bit.
Yeah. Let's see, do you have a particular story or anecdote about Ed to give an idea of who he was?
I think so, more so than the story. They're just visual images about him. In a reclining position, with breathing assistance, and how when you enter a room with that, and when you could hear the respirator, you could hear him breathe. So, when he'd get up on stage, because he had to speak, and he would always say, give me a couple minutes to get my lungs full of air. And he have that breathing device, be sucking on it, kind of get himself full of oxygen so he could get out a sentence or two sentences. So I come back to images like that. Come back the images of the iron lung. So the stories are pretty consistent, meaning the way he carried himself, but the images are pretty graphic. And ultimately the poster they made about being an artichoke. Those things were him. Those images kind of told his story.
Yeah. What was there a moment when you realized that Ed was a game changer?
Well, I think from the beginning, because he personally impacted me, and that could have been enough for him, right? Obviously, it wasn't. I'm sure going to college there, and then the rolling quads, and then the start of the center, and then realizing that this wasn't just something in California, and it wasn't even just something in the United States. It was truly global. I think none of us has to prove anything. You know what I mean? And I just think it became his lifestyle. It became his passion. It became his commitment. And so I think that's the impact is. I don't want to make it totally about it's kind of like the story of Judy and Ed, and then ultimately Berkeley, and now what you realize, God, that was going on in Boston, and God, that was going on in Denver, and God, guess what? There are places around the world that are further along on some issues than we are here in our own state, and and that people actually have a right to health care in other parts of the world. Here we don't, and so I think that constant learning, stuff. You want to admire somebody and you appreciate somebody, and glad I've been connected to people like Ed and Wade and folks now. There's the whole generation of folks like yourself now that just a whole nother spin on this stuff, a whole nother, rising of the bar, right? What you do or don't celebrate. But we'll get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Tatum and I were just talking the other day about how wild it is for us to just think about how recent, like the fact that we can have these conversations with the people who started the movement for disabled people to have rights, it's wild.
That we're still alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're actually have access like we do now, because back then it was phone calls.
Mm-hmm.
Or it was like you belonged to an organization because you couldn't wait until you got the magazine. And now you just grab your iPhone, there's the information. So the tools available to allow this interaction right here to happen are to us. Now we just got to take time to use them and not limit it to a certain number of characters.
Yes. Yes, you can have your full page. We'll so our last two questions, we'll pair them together, are what should youth be advocating for to carry on Ed's legacy, and what would be Ed's dream for the disability community today?
I think the sooner you identify, the better. I think no, you're not alone. There's a huge community, and I do mean huge. If we believe the numbers, we know there's 1 in 4 of us, and we know there's billions of us around the world. We talked about it a couple of times, just the power of your story, not, you don't have to promote someone else's story, tell your story, it's okay. And that it's all right not to be perfect, kind of stuff. And I just think, those are, you have to remind yourself, because I made a mistake. No, I'm not going to try that because I might make a mistake, or someone might think this about me. No, you just know that your story, you identify and you tell your story, and you'd be amazed at how many peers you'll ultimately have.
Yeah.
So, and I think, just, dream wise, it's, back to what we talked about with Tatum's flag over her right shoulder was, here we are in 2021, and we really don't have an official declaration of Disability Pride Month yet. Mm-hmm. Now, is that because we haven't asked the right people? Does that mean we haven't done enough strategizing? Does that mean we got more organizing to do? Do we have more dots to connect? And I would say all of the above. But the fact that we're in 2021, right, and we still don't have that is an indicator really how young the movement really still is, which is okay. This stuff takes a long time. And I just think, personally would love to see, Ed would love to see more of us in elected office. Here we are in 2021. Can you identify more people than your hands and your toes? That are peers. I don't mean just disabled people. I mean peers that get it, that are connected to the movement. I think he'd like to see more of his business owners. And I don't mean there aren't disabled people who own business, but once again, disabled business owners who get it, who are connected to the movement, who support the movement. So we have, I'm not naive. I've done a little bit. People as you get older are going to do more, but there are certain things we just don't do well yet. And I think this is my personal advice. is we just need to look in the mirror every once in a while and be honest with ourselves about where the movement is. And we're still in the infant stages. Mm-hmm. You know, we were talking about rights, access, then we were talking about rights, and we weren't really talking about justice back then.
Yeah.
You know, we weren't talking about the environment. You know, we weren't talking about climate. You know, we weren't talking about and how that disproportionately, whatever's right. Or we were talking about problems and not solutions. Well, we live the experience. We need to me personally, articulate more of the solutions. You know, let the rest of the universe follow us and catch up with us because we got the answers.
Yeah, I love that. That's a perfect note to end on. And thank you so much for your time, Mark. This has been a really cool experience for me. I'm gonna yeah, and I'm excited to get to be a part of the project. So I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, and let's hope we stay in touch.
Absolutely.